guys, and welcome to this watercolor tutorial. Today we're gonna paint this very simple lilac flower. There are actually many ways to paint these with watercolors depending on how much time you have and how detailed you want the end result to be. This painting took me around 40 minutes and all you need is some watercolor paper, one medium-sized round brush and one very fine detailing brush. So this is definitely a little bit more detailed approach to painting a lilac flower. So I usually like to start paintings like this from a light pencil sketch. I started by kind of marking the overall size and shape of the flower a little bit, and after you have some of these outlines in place, we can start defining some of the initial flowers a little bit more. Lilac flowers have 4 petals, so I started to draw these 4 petal shapes all over my main shape. I also made some of these singular petals towards the top and also on the edges of the flower, and then drew these bigger shapes more in the middle part. Your flowers can and should definitely overlap a little bit, and you don't really need to draw everything super clearly here. Just having a loose idea of the placements and the sizes of the bigger flower details is good enough. I also sketched out the shapes for the leaves to the lower part of the drawing, but after that we can move on to the actual watercoloring part. I decided to use very light violet and pinkish tones for my flower, but you could definitely change the colors and do pretty much any color combination you want. The paints I mixed to get these shades were Ultramarine Finest and Permanent Carmine. I think switching between a few different tones makes the end result a little bit more interesting, so you can see how I was switching between different colors in this whole painting process. But yeah, so just following my initial sketch, I started to create these very light flower shapes here. You can see how I also tried to leave some of these white stripes to the flowers because I thought those would look very pretty in the final picture, kind of add some highlights to our flowers. But you don't have to do it in this step if it feels a little bit too difficult. You can always add white details later if you have a white pen or gouache paint to work with. We're actually going to do that in this tutorial as well, so you can see how I use my gouache paint a little bit later. But anyway, I was first working with these bigger flowers that will kind of end up being the ones in the front. I wanted these to be the lightest and most clearly defined in this picture. So I used a very small amount of paint and a lot of water to lighten the colors as much as possible. But then after you think you have enough of these light flowers, we can start to work with the empty spaces between them. If you don't want your colors to blend together in any point, make sure you leave a small white space between all your shapes, or just let the first flowers dry before moving on to this next step. So this time I used a little bit darker colors and I started to create these darker areas to some of these white spots. All of these darker shapes don't even need to look like flowers because they will kind of just end up being the background shadows in this whole picture. I I actually think I went a little bit too dark with the colors here, so if you would like your whole flower to have slightly less color variation or lighter tone in the end, you could definitely lighten up the colors here a little bit more. Again, don't be afraid to add some color variation here and there. It definitely helps to make the end result look a little bit more natural and interesting. If you don't have much time, I think you could definitely leave this painting here and call it a day, but if you would like to challenge yourself by adding a little bit more details to the flowers, that's exactly what we're gonna do next. Until this point, we've been using the bigger brush, but now I'm switching to the small detailing brush so we can get some of these sharper lines in here. So I wanted to add some outlines to these bigger flowers so that they would stand out against the background a little bit more. And I also added some darkness to the center points of some of these flowers. There's really no right way to go about this step, so don't be afraid to experiment with some details in the flowers. I also added some more lines and shadows to the darker spots we created. And the goal here is just to make the flower look a little bit fuller and more detailed. I think it's a good idea to have the center parts of the flower a little bit darker, and then the edges can be a little bit lighter and have more of those white spaces around the petals. So if you feel like your flower starts to look like just one plop of color, maybe leaving a little bit more white between all the different details or making the color differences a little bit more noticeable might help you out. Then, as I mentioned before, next I wanted to add some more white details to this picture. I think it's a great way to add some pretty highlights and just further help to differentiate the petals from each other. So I used white gouache paint for this, which is just a super thick paint that is perfect for this purpose. And I used the same small brush we've already used here. So I added some small dots in the middle points of some of these flowers and then added some white stripes to the petals. This step is completely optional, but I think it might help, especially if you think that the colors got a little bit too dark or muddy. Then before adding some finishing touches to the flowers, I went ahead and painted the leaves and the whole lower part at this point. I went with this bluish green tone for the leaves, and you can see how again I tried leaving these thin white areas in the middle of the leaf, and I think it just helps to add a little bit more definition to the middle bridge part of the leaf. I think learning how to leave these white spaces in your watercolor paintings can really open up the door for many different types of details and accents you can now have in your paintings. But then I added some darker color to the tips of the leaves. With watercolors in general, as long as the area is still wet, you can add a drop of darkness somewhere and it will still blend together with the rest of the colors. Then I added some more darker lines to the leaves, but I actually colored the branch before doing that so that the first layers of the leaves had a little bit time to dry. So those lines won't necessarily blend with the rest of the leaves. So now that the leaves are done, you can decide if you still want to add some final details to the flowers. Again, while painting the leaves, most of the flowers had time to dry, so these last final details won't blend with the rest of the colors anymore. I wanted to add some even darker lines to define some of the flowers even better and add slightly more contrast to this whole picture. Actually, in the end, I wasn't completely happy how this flower turned out, and I just want to say that this style is definitely not the easiest thing to master with watercolors, so even if it doesn't go exactly as planned on the first go, don't worry about it too much and maybe just try again later. I think this is a great picture to learn how to control your watercolors, because this type of painting requires quite a bit of control to get a pretty outcome where all the petals and colors won't end up mixing together. So just give yourself a few tries and try not to be too critical of the final outcome. But anyway, that finally finishes up this simple picture. I really hope you enjoyed watching this quick tutorial and that it will help you with your watercolor practice. If you want to see even more monthly tutorials from me, please check out my Patreon. I post an extra tutorial there every month and you can right away get in access to all the previous tutorials as well. But I guess that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having an amazing day or night wherever you are, and see you in my next one. Bye bye!